We're going to have the next in our agenda of fine speakers. It'll be a fireside chat between two of the wise minds from the Australian Institute of Machine Learning, Director Simon Lucey and Founding Director Anton van den Hengel.
All right, so I was the director of the Australian Institute for Machine Learning for the first 3 years of its life. Wound up moving largely to Amazon, although I'm still partly a professor at the University of Adelaide. We looked for a long time to try to find somebody who was willing to take over more than anything. Right? It's a tough job, and you've got to have solid skills in computer vision, but also a lot more than that. So it's not a job for everybody, and I must admit the field that I'm in, that we're in, there are some personality traits that come to the fore in that field that don't necessarily lead themselves to management, which made the search even harder. But one of the people that we'd been trying to convince for a long time that it was time to come back to Australia was a research professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Carnegie Mellon is one of the best places in the world for machine learning, but particularly for robotics. The Australian Institute for Machine Learning is now number 2 in the world in computer vision, which is one of the most competitive bits of machine learning. But robotics robotics kind of moved 10 years before computer vision did, and CMU was at the forefront of that. And being a professor at such an incredible institution is an amazing recommendation. And of course, that person's Simon. So Simon Lucey is a professor now at the University of Adelaide and the current director of the Australian Institute for Machine Learning, and probably 3 other things that he can tell you about.
Thank you, Anton. I think after that introduction, the only way is down. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I actually spent about 12 years of my career in the US. I was at Carnegie Mellon, and I also worked for 3.5 years at an autonomous car startup. It started as a startup, now I don't know what we call it now, it's some big entity. Argo AI. And I think the thing that really kind of, I loved my time in the US, but I always wanted to come back to Australia. But I'm actually originally from Queensland. And so oftentimes when I write my notes, I say, well, who do you know in Adelaide? What's your connection to Adelaide? I have no connection to Adelaide whatsoever. I like wine, it's about it. So the thing that really, I think, that is the real opportunity here in South Australia is really what people are noticing outside of South Australia about the opportunities here. And the thing that I saw was I spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh shares a lot of similarities. I don't know how much you guys know about Pittsburgh. Most people know the Pittsburgh Steelers, but it's a Rust Belt city. And it very much made its fortune in the 50s and 60s, and earlier than that in steel. And then obviously globalization hit. A lot of those Rust Belt cities got hit. But what was really interesting with Pittsburgh, it reinvented itself in terms of tech and health. And I saw, and what they did is that they had really strong educational prowess in certain areas, robotics, AI, ML. And so one thing that really attracted me when I was choosing on where to go back to in Australia was that Adelaide had this little gem here. This little gem that basically not all the people were even aware of, that they had this globally ranked institute and university in AI, and they had very, very similar tapestry to Pittsburgh. I think Adelaide's a prettier city than Pittsburgh, although my wife's from Pittsburgh, she might slap me over the back of the head over that. But I think there's a lot going for it, and so that's why I think it's such a wonderful time to be in the city and the state, because it really is on the cusp of something. And so that was one of the reasons that I decided to come back, and I'm very excited to be here.
Wonderful. So maybe you could give everybody an impression of where the field's at and where AI/ML stands in this amazing space.
Yeah, no problem. So I think in our space it's very easy to fall into the mistake of jargon. We hear the word AI sort of like thrown around flamboyantly for everything. As many of you guys probably know, the term AI was first invented in a small little conference in Dartmouth in 1956. And probably for the following sort of 40 years or so, everyone thought it was an abject failure, like nothing was sort of coming out of it. I remember kind of even getting, even mentioning the word AI during my PhD was sort of a very, very dangerous thing to say. But what's been amazing is that there's been this area of AI pretty much within the machine learning community called computer vision that really kind of drove a lot of the field initially. And so I think Terry pointed it out, and we get the assumption that AI didn't start in 2011, and there's this famous thing called AlexNet that came out in 2011, and it's pretty much a computer vision algorithm. And that computer vision algorithm really pushed the entire field forward. And so what's really sort of amazing is that in that space of computer vision, Australia and the University of Adelaide and the institute that I'm lucky enough to be directing, we're actually ranked 3rd in the world at the moment. And so ahead of MIT, ahead of every European university, and not a lot of people know about it, not enough people know about it, but it is really a massive comparative advantage because the next century is not going to be about just adopting AI, it's going to be about innovating AI. And the big opportunities are connecting the innovators to the opportunities. And that's a real sort of opportunity here for Adelaide and South Australia.
Fantastic. And there's, well, you know, I wanted to tell you what I think about why computer vision was the area that took off, right? And why AlexNet really was such a revolution. A lot of the machine learning for outside of computer vision is symbolic, right? So chess is a symbolic problem. You know, crossword puzzles, even really stock markets and these sorts of things are symbolic problems. So they live in closed worlds that are relatively artificial. So, you know, the chess app on your phone is not AI. It's just an algorithm. It's actually a really simple problem to solve because chess is a closed world, right? There's only 64 spots on the board. There's only 24 things you can move. It's actually a really simple problem to solve. The real world is a horrible, messy problem to solve. It's complicated, nothing ever looks the same way twice, and it's not symbolic. In our jargon, it's an open world problem. The real world doesn't have a finite number of things in it. And the number of things in it changes in response to the question you ask. And the computer vision is at the forefront of that. Computer vision is about trying to relate information captured from images to symbols, right? It's pretty much translating from the real world to symbols, which means that you can then apply all of that symbolic stuff that we already know how to do. And AlexNet was the first network that really outperformed humans at that kind of task, right? And particularly, coincidentally, one of the things it was applied to was distinguishing images of cats from images of dogs, which at least half of the room have heard me talk about before. But it's a really interesting problem because your toddler can do it. Right? Your toddler can do it quite accurately. But if you want to ask a human to write that code to do it, they've really got almost no chance of succeeding. And probably the best thing you could do would be to write a green detector, because dogs are more likely to hang out on lawns. So, given that potted history of computer vision, I'll give Simon a tough question, which is what's next?
Yeah, so I mean, and that's sort of the billion or trillion dollar question. And I'm going to touch upon a little bit of this. I've got a talk coming up after this where I'm going to go into a bit more detail. But I think one of the really big challenges at the moment is where we're seeing a lot of success is in applications of computer vision where we have an inordinate amount of data. For instance, humans are naturally narcissistic. We have lots of images of faces. So computer vision really excels faces, and perhaps sometimes to our own sort of detriment in terms of society. There are some tools it's not being used for. But many other applications. In the autonomous car industry, we have this issue that sort of when we're collecting all this data, we're drowning in data, but then we start labeling things. And cars are very, very common. Bicycles, a little less common, but common. People, very common. Small children running out in the middle of the street, not very common, but very, very important. So computer vision has this issue at the moment that the data distributions in the real world don't match the data of our value propositions. What do we care most about? And so that asymmetry is a real issue. And there's a bunch of things being pushed upon to sort of address that. Some of that is, there's a fancy term in machine learning called unsupervised learning. So unsupervised learning is where you can just throw in lots of data without labels. And a lot of people believe that's the way forward. A lot of people who love special effects and graphics, they very much believe that we should simulate the world. If I can simulate the world, and I can get an AI to learn everything, I can make it match that value proposition. That's seeing some success, but there's always a gap. You can always see when things are kind of a bit fake. And so that's been sort of been met with mixed results. So I think one of the big challenges is sort of the mismatch between the distribution of the real world and the distribution that we want in our application. And how do we sort of jump over that quite large schism is a big challenge for our generation and the next generation coming through.
So extending that question, and in the same vein as with the questions for Karen, Matt, and Tom earlier, we're doing quite well in computer vision, but there's an incredible amount of investment happening in the rest of the world, not just from government, but from companies as well. Where do we stand?
There is incredible investment going in by various countries around the world. If you look at sort of AI investment in terms of GDP, it's quite sobering. Australia is quite much at the bottom of the ladder in that respect. But there is a lot of investment from big tech. One of the realities, for instance, and I think Anton was one of the first examples here in Australia, but in the US, for instance, I couldn't name an academic that doesn't have a joint appointment in a company. All the companies over there realise that where the value and the money is to be made is in AI innovation, not just AI consumption. And so they're trying to connect directly to where that AI innovation is coming from. And so I think that the investments coming from venture capital, there's a lot of venture capital floating around the US. But one of the issues too, I think, is that there's a real opportunity for Australia, because the way that these big companies are tackling AI are scalable for some problems. Say, if you invest enough money, you'll probably get an autonomous car with it, just as a matter of money, getting enough data. But there are a lot of other problems where you cannot hit it with that sort of approach. And so there's a big opportunity, I think, here in Australia for innovating AI and coming up with new ways of solving AI that don't require huge amounts of compute, huge amounts of data, but being able to come across with world-class products that differentiate ourselves from the rest of the world. And I think companies are starting to realise that. We're here today with AWS and Amazon. They're seeing a value proposition here, and many others are following.
There's a question here. How can SMEs compete with big players to attract talent?
It's a really, really good question. I don't have a great answer for that, but I can give you an answer in terms of talent isn't just about the salary. It's maybe 95% about the salary, but it's not just about the salary. I remember, and I won't say what big company it was, but a big company, say 5 years ago, I actually got a job offer from. They wanted to attract myself and some students, and we were going to move over there, but they had a strict policy that everything that was done within the company had to be closed, had to be patented, we weren't able to talk about it, closed shop. And the reality is that it doesn't matter how much you're going to pay people, top people are not going to go work for that company. And so the days of being extremely closed and being secret squirrel about AI are over, because there is always another company that's going to pay almost just as much and that's going to be open. And what's happened now is, especially with big companies, they've all changed their policies. They realise this now, and they're all trying to open that. So I think there's some sort of lesson there in terms of even being more open if you're an SME, sort of giving, you might not be able to have a pay scale, but that freedom, saying, look, we just want you to think about our ideas, and identifying the parts of AI that are going to be the most important for your problem. The thing that the big companies have done really well is that Anton and I go to it every year, if we're allowed to fly. There's this big conference. It's almost like the Woodstock of computer vision. It's called CVPR. If you want to get the most number of nerds possible into one concentrated area, that's probably your best bet. But it's like the Woodstock of nerds. It's like, say, 10, 12,000 people, and all the big companies run these rolling parties. And basically, if you're a grad student in the space, it is like you are having a fantastic time. But what's really strategic in some of these companies is that they're dictating the problems that these students care about. They're investing in, we want you to look at this problem. And so if you look at the papers and what's coming out in that field, they're dictating that. So there's a real role for SMEs to actually kind of start to take a role in that. How do you start to actually, what are the problems that we care about? But you'd have to go about it in a different way. But I think there's, and for Australia as a middle power, I think that's something we really need to think about. We're not a big superpower. How do we get the world AI community to care about the problems that we care about in Australia? And so that's a challenge. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think it's a good question.
And the competition for staff in Australia in this area is much, much lower than everywhere else. So, every academic in this space in the US is working for one of the big companies or one of their startups. The same thing in Europe, whereas here there are oceans of academics who are not, right? They're looking for people to engage with. One of the things, the spend on R&D in Australia every year is 1.5% of GDP. Right? That's an embarrassing fraction, and puts us at the bottom of the OECD and behind a whole lot of countries that you don't want us to be behind. Right? Our research spend in Australia is embarrassing. But that's a great opportunity for SMEs. The big place where that's missing is out of companies. I mean, the Australian government spend on R&D is very low, but BHP barely have a research division, right? So if you're an SME trying to hire people in Australia, you're not competing with the biggest companies in Australia. You're now competing with Amazon, but you're not competing with Apple. You're not competing with Microsoft. You may soon be competing with Google, who seem to be about to put $1 billion in. But the reason that Amazon is in Australia is because the hiring opportunities here are better than anywhere in the world, right? So if you're not hiring people here, then you're just either not offering them the package or you're not offering them the opportunity.
I was going to follow that. I don't think we realise how good we have it here in that regard. Like when I was a professor at CMU, I gave up about 3 or 4 years ago hiring postdocs. I wouldn't do it. Because what would happen is that basically we'd offer them a pretty good package. They'd come and get 6 months at CMU. They'd have the CMU brand on them. And they'd be offered $300K to go to work for the company down the road. We couldn't hire them. Here, I think Amos is full of postdocs. We've got postdocs all over the place. So there's a tremendous opportunity for SMEs here at the moment. Because we have an AI talent that is matched by the talent that you see in Europe, the US, and China, but much lower pays and actually much more available. Now, that's not going to last forever. I remember probably just when I arrived back at CMU for my second time, there was an incident which we called the raid. Everyone at CMU just knew it. It's called the raid. So overnight, Uber came in and basically hired nearly half our robotics factory. They just took the lot. And so overnight, it came out of nowhere. And from there on in, it became impossible to get talent. And so the same thing's probably going to happen here. And it's just about us thinking about what's going to happen and also how can we extract out the best advantage from it for South Australians.
The question off the board here, I have been paraphrasing these questions, but it's one of the advantages of sitting up here is I get to determine not only which ones, but how I'm going to read them out. So one of them is, what's the real ethical concern with AI?
Ooh, that's a great one to start with. Everyone should have a sip of wine before I answer that one. I think there's a lot of ways to kind of peel that. I think one thing, for instance, is we need to be doing better with our young people. Anyone taking a course in computer science or AI, it should be mandatory that they be having to take some sort of course in ethics and ethical use of AI. That's happening around the world. I don't see that happening as much here. I think we're realising that needs to happen, but it starts from the ground up. I think also ethical AI goes hand in hand with also Australia wanting to innovate in AI. If we want to have a say at the table over how AI is being deployed in our society, we need to be world leaders in it. Otherwise, we're just not going to be listened to. And so if we want to have a seat at the table, this idea of us being world-class in innovating in AI goes hand in hand with this idea of ethical AI. Because if we don't, it's basically the superpowers and the large multinationals, Amazon, I apologise, but I'm going to throw them in there, that basically get to dictate that. And so Australia being a middle power, we need to have a larger voice in how that's coming about. And so I believe investing fundamentally in innovation in AI in Australia will directly help with some of the issues that we have about ethical AI, because we can actually transport the values we have in Australia to how it's being used and the problems that are being addressed.
I agree completely, right. If we're not a participant in the coming AI economy, our position, our ethical position will be completely irrelevant. Right? We've just seen, one of the other questions up there is, are Australian politics using AI? Well, they're attempting to, but Facebook is here. Facebook is AI driven, right? And Facebook is influencing politics. We've all witnessed the power of Facebook, the political power of Facebook. Right? The question, it's the same answer for absolutely everything. That AI transforms these markets, and you either participate or you get left behind. The ethical risk for Australia is that we become a market where Californians come to make money. Right? Uber are already. So a federal politician asked me recently, we dig stuff up and run tractors around farms. What's the risk really here? Right? It's all owned by us. It's done by us. Uber came and injected itself into a bunch of transactions that happen in Australia, between Australians, on Australian roads, using Australian cars under Australian laws. Right? And they take out the value in that transaction because they own data and they are better at using it. Right? If Uber can take the value out of trips, from home to work, then it won't be long before we're all just Uber tractor drivers. Right? The profit out of all of those sectors will be taken by people who are better at using information. And the question for us is whether they're going to be Australian or not. Right? Whether those people are going to pay tax here, and as a result, whether we're going to have any control over what they do. The reason that Australia joined the space race recently was because Kevin Rudd wanted us to have a seat at the Security Council, and that's how you do it. Right? You participate in the technology at the time. If we don't participate in this technology, then we won't have a seat at the table. Our position will be irrelevant. Right? We've just seen the federal government try to have a go at Google about effectively this issue and lose. Right? Because we don't have a stake. Right? That's not how that process works. Asking them nicely doesn't have that impact. The ethical question for Australia, as far as I'm concerned, is whether we're going to expand into this space and develop an Australian brand in AI, We have the capacity. You know, when the Chinese ships were still coming here, the sailors were all getting off and buying Australian baby food. Right? They were buying Australian baby food in pallets, like not in jars, right? In pallets of jars, and shipping it back to China. Because if you buy Australian baby food, then that's got carrots and mashed pumpkin in it, then that jar has carrots and mashed pumpkin in it. Right? Because we have a set of liberal democratic institutions that make sure that it's got in it what it says on the tin. Right? The same opportunity exists for Australia to have a brand in ethical AI. AI that does what it says on the tin and doesn't do anything else. The question is, so there's us, maybe there's Canada, possibly the UK that could pull it off. Right? But we're in a really good spot to capture that opportunity. The question is just whether we're going to invest in it. And at the moment, I'm afraid the evidence is otherwise.
I was just going to agree with everything you said there, and I was also going to throw in, I mentioned earlier, this divide. What the big challenge for computer vision is over the next 10 years. It's the divide between the distribution of data in the real world compared to the distribution that you want for your value proposition. I think not for all of ethical AI, but a lot of ethical AI is tied up in that. It's not actually the programmers coding the code, it's the data. The data is distributed poorly, that it has biases inherently. And so there's no real way in AI and computer vision at the moment to rectify those biases easily. And so again, by fundamentally investing in innovation, we can address those issues. Doing this simply through policy or curating the data sets is not going to solve the problem. You need innovation. And that's why I really believe that. I don't think innovation is the only thing in ethical AI, but I think it's something that you can actually do to address a lot of the big issues that people are worried about.
I'm not getting a wind up yet, so we just keep going, right? An easy one then, Simon, as a former participant in one of the biggest driverless car startups, why haven't I got a driverless car? And when will we have a completely computer vision driven driverless car?
Well, first off, you're not that nice to me, so that's why I haven't shared it with you. So one reason, so it's a really good question. So why aren't we seeing autonomous cars everywhere at the moment? You're probably very aware of sort of the Teslas. They're kind of purporting to have sort of level 4, level 5 type autonomy on them. But one of the real issues holding it back is the way that current autonomous car companies are trying to solve the problem. And they're basically trying to solve it through memorization, for lack of a better word. They're basically thinking, if we can capture every possible scenario that I will ever encounter, then I can actually solve the problem of autonomous driving. And that's proving to be really, really difficult. And so they're collecting more and more data, but they're really struggling to actually kind of like get to that level of performance, because it's the things that you don't expect. It's the small child running out on the street. It's the change in traffic signs. The things that are sort of out there and not very, very likely, that's what they struggle with. Now that being said, I do think in the next couple of years we will be seeing AVs deployed, but there'll be a much more constrained area. Certain cities, I think for long-haul trucks and transport, you'll be seeing it, but I don't think we'll be seeing the Jetsons in the next couple of years. But who knows? It's great to be proven wrong. I hope we all have an autonomous car ride in our futures very, very soon.
In a similar vein, how long until the singularity? And when can I expect the Terminator to serve me fish and chips, a load of fish and chip shop?
Imminently. I don't know. I mean, it's funny. I always laugh about those questions because it really kind of falls into. I think in the West we tend to have this dystopian view over technology and AI. Sort of, I think, when's it going to come and kind of take all our jobs and destroy humanity? I really like the view the East has in this regard, that it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for humanity. I think technology is the real thing that's it's the hope and the promise of the future. And that's the narrative I like to lean into. And the real thing too is that we want to leave this world a better world for our children and our children's children. And one of the big things is not just AI, it's just innovation in general. that is the silver bullet. That's the thing that we need to be investing in, and that's the way forward, I think.
I think that a big part of the problem with trying to predict when AGI is coming, artificial general intelligence, when we're going to hit the point where the machines are smarter than we are, is anthropomorphizing, where if you stick a couple of googly eyes on a rock, people will give it a name. Yeah? The truth is that we're really no closer to AGI now than we were 50 years ago. Right? It's not. I don't agree with Matt Mikhailovich's position that it's theoretically impossible. Like, every one of us here is carrying around a surprisingly different bag of wet goo in their head that seems to manage it. So it can't be that hard, right? But nonetheless, we really don't know any more about it than we did. There's a great line in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where they meet a cloud of purple gas that's much smarter than they are. It's just that they've got nothing in common to talk about, right? It's the intelligence, I think, at the moment is defined really kind of in terms of us rather than abstractly. And most of what we see, there was a great one where Google had a bot ring up and book a haircut for somebody. So which is actually a relatively simple thing to do, right? So this bot rings up and has a conversation with somebody about booking a haircut, and everybody takes it as if it's some great step forward, because they assume that that bot can also ring up and order some new tyres for your car, or book you a seat in a restaurant. The truth is, it can't, right? It does one thing. Right? Your phone is smarter than you are, right? Your phone knows a whole lot of stuff about you. It plays chess better than you do. It does arithmetic a whole lot better than you do, right? I can guarantee it. But it's not. It's not AGI. Right? And it's no closer to AGI than anything else was. The problem with reaching AGI is us, not the technology.
Yeah, I agree. I was just going to tack on to the end of that. There was a great quote a couple of years ago by a very famous AI professor, Andrew Hengel, and he used to say that basically current AI, or machine learning, is very good at replicating humans if the task only goes for about a second. If it goes longer than a second, that's where AI drops off. So I always talk to people in SMEs or companies, if you want to know what an AI can do and can't do, your second test is a great test. And if you look at a lot of the AI, say autonomous cars, the way they're trying to solve that is that they're trying to break down the task of autonomous driving into mini 1 second tests that you engineer together, and they're just trying to cobble together that AI. But sort of general AI, that is a broader proposition, isn't it? So that's a situation where you can't just memorize, you have to really reason and think, and it's very much sort of, I think it's a fantastic challenge, but we're very much in the early days, I think.